Alright, hello everyone, my name is Brennan Bean, and today I'm going to talk to you about my essay called Somewhere Between Good and Bad, which is an analysis of the Molly Maguires. So in order to understand the Molly Maguires, it's really important to look at their origins and how they came to be. So in the 1860s, America was really split between the North and South due to the Civil War. And this created this really high demand for anthracite coal. So it was going at a really high price, and because of this, there was a really high demand for low-paying workers, such as Irish immigrants. So a lot of Irish came over from Europe. They were also coming off the famine, so it was a tough time over there. The Irish immigrants were really looking for work. They were often willing to work for a lower wage than the average American worker. They were really just looking to put food on the table for their families. And another reason that they left Europe was due to the poor conditions over there in the factories. But unfortunately for them, they kind of discovered that things really weren't so different over here, if not worse. Especially in the mines, there were really no regulations put in place, so mines were extremely dangerous. Death occurred on a daily basis there, just really bad conditions. One example of this would be the Avondale mine fire, which killed about 110 workers. Unfortunately, there was a fire at the top of the mine shaft, and there was no alternate exit despite calls for there to be one installed. So people were really upset about this, and unfortunately, a lot of people lost their lives that day. But it did lead to the forming of the WBA, which was a labor association, and this kind of inspired a lot of the Irish immigrants there to form their own labor association. So they decided to form their own one called the AOH, basically the Ancient Order of Hibernians. And this was only for Irish immigrant workers. I chose this picture here just because this is from a movie, so this isn't actually a picture of the Molly Maguires, but it kind of gives you a good idea of what it would be like to be working in a mine shaft in these really dangerous conditions. So upon their arrival to America, and specifically eastern Pennsylvania for the Molly Maguires, these Irish immigrants faced a lot of discrimination. This is something that they really used to help band together. We see this a lot. A lot of groups are formed in history when they face oppression. So the Molly Maguires were really no exception to that. This sign here says "Help Wanted, No Irish Need Apply." So a lot of the higher paying jobs or more desirable jobs were hanging these signs up, which forced the Irish immigrants to have to work these lower, less desirable jobs, such as working in a mine shaft. There was really just a lot of prejudice in the area, but this is kind of par for the course when you experience history. Any group that is immigrating to a new area that may have something distinguishable about them, such as an accent or skin color. There's often a lot of resistance to change, so it's really no surprise that the Irish immigrants were discriminated against. So in 1875, a lot of the Molly Maguires had become really fed up with the conditions that they were and the treatment that they were receiving. So they started striking, and it's called the Long Strike. So just to kind of give you an idea of the conditions that they were working with, from the book The Real Molly Maguires, author Anthony Bimba says, "The horrors of mining were literally indescribable. There were no provisions for safety or proper ventilation within the pits. Mine inspectors were unheard of. The health and lives of the miners were at the mercy of the operators who bitterly opposed every move for protective legislature." So this kind of gives you a better idea of why the Molly Maguires were striking and really looking for a better lives. Well, the strike was really just trying to improve conditions, receive better pay, and receive some equal treatment for the discrimination that they were experiencing. A lot of these it was a really tough time for a lot of these workers just because the strike, they weren't being paid, so a lot of these workers didn't really know where their next meal was going to come from and how they were going to feed their family. And another important thing about the strike was that it really set the precedent for labor strikes that would follow, and it also helped accelerate labor reform. So if the strike hadn't taken place, then labor reform may have not come for decades after. So another important note from here would be during the strike, a lot of violence broke out, which we will get into in a little bit. But the iron and coal officials basically they started a group of officials that were called the Pennsylvania Cossacks, who were instructed to kill violent strikers. So this kind of gives you an idea of the environment and how hostile it was during the strike. So to give an example of the violence that I mentioned earlier, one instance would be the murder of Benjamin Yost. Benjamin Yost was a police officer who allegedly beat senselessly one of the Molly Maguires, and on July 14th of 1875, he was murdered while on duty by a group of Molly Maguires who were in retaliation for the beating. One of the smart things, I guess you could say, that the Molly Maguires did was to recruit members from outside of the region to carry out the attacks that they would, once they found a victim, they would basically let a member know from outside the region so that they wouldn't be recognized. So that helped them keep their cover. Another instance would be the murder of Thomas Sanger, who was a foreman, and William Uren, who was a miner. There was apparently a workplace dispute between Thomas Sanger and one of the Molly Maguires, and they essentially murdered Thomas Sanger, and because William Uren was a witness to the crime, they murdered him as well. This one, though, the Molly Maguires faced retaliation for, so 3 masked men attacked the suspected Molly Maguires who were involved in the killing. The masked men entered the home of the suspected killers. They killed one of them, shot another, and actually murdered one of the pregnant wives of the Molly Maguires. It was never really found out who actually carried it out, but it's widely thought to be members of the Coal and Iron Police. So this really demonstrates that there was violence on both sides, and that it was just a really tough time for both sides, especially the Molly Maguires, considering they were facing the brunt of this. They were really facing the tough conditions, and this one really started the suspicion of an inside informant within the Molly Maguires, because they wondered how they could have known who was involved in the killing. So this brings us to our next character. So this violence that I described really caught the attention of the nation, garnered a lot of attention, including the Pinkerton Detective Agency, who at the time were America's most famous private detective agency. They chose a representative to go and infiltrate the Molly Maguires and see what was going on, see if they could obtain evidence of wrongdoing, see if they could bring them down. And they chose this man, James McParland, who went in under the alias James McKenna, and his job was to essentially gain the trust of the Molly Maguires and obtain evidence. And that's exactly what he did. He obtained evidence that was used on the trials to convict members of the Molly Maguires. So using the evidence from McParland and his testimony, over 60 men who were thought to be connected with the Molly Maguires were arrested and put on trial. Leading up to the trial and even beforehand, completely before the whole trial, there was a strong narrative in the media that the Molly Maguires were terrorists and that they were the ones to blame. So this definitely worked against them. On top of that, the judges were biased. They were thought to be very sympathetic to the Coal and Iron Police. Another factor was there were no Irish Americans present on any of the juries. And the majority of the members of the juries were German immigrants who self-admittedly did not know very much of the English language at the time. So that was another thing that really skewed the results and worked against them and really made it it's known as a really unfair trial in history. So in July of 1877, 20 men thought to be connected with the Molly Maguires were hanged. And many consider this to be a really unfair trial, and a common narrative is that this has just been a real injustice was done here with the killing of these men. So one of the big issues that I wanted to tackle when I was writing this paper was determining whether the media sources were right in calling them terrorists. It was a question that I wanted to find the answer to. So to start, to make my determination, I first started by looking at the FBI definition of domestic terrorism, and that is stated as violent criminal acts committed by individuals or groups to further ideological goals stemming from domestic influences such as those of a political, religious, social, racial, or environmental nature. So there's definitely a strong argument for the fact that the Molly Maguires were committing violent acts in order to further their ideology. But I think that it's really important to consider their circumstances. Their ideology was to receive fair treatment. They were trying to achieve better conditions, lessen discrimination. These are not bad things inherently. They are qualities of high moral standing. So I think that it's hard to sit here and judge them for what they did, considering it's hard to put ourselves in the shoes of people who are really, really struggling like that, struggling to put food on the table. I just don't think that it's my place necessarily to judge people who are committing violent acts, but in the name of something that they truly believe in and something that they feel that they need to do in order to be free and achieve equality. So my conclusion was that terrorism is a bit too, or being terrorist is a bit too drastic of a term to classify them as. I think that when we try to classify things in the real world, we would like to label them as being black or white, but in reality, things usually lie somewhere in between. And I think that the Molly Maguires are a perfect example of that. They definitely did a lot of good things, and without them, history wouldn't be the same. And labor reform certainly wouldn't be the same. But they definitely used some questionable methods. But yeah, I think that they lie somewhere between good and bad, and I don't think that they were necessarily terrorists. I don't think that that's a fair term to use to describe them. So that's all for my presentation on the Molly Maguires. Thank you guys for listening.